Section 29 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3, Section 29. Chapter 11. Individual Views of Senators of the Select Committee, Part 2. Mr. Howard H. Baker, Jr., U.S. Senator from the State of Tennessee. I believe that the activities and inquiry of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities have been, by and large, useful and appropriate. The bipartisan tone for the committee was established by the unanimous adoption of Senate Resolution 60 by the vote of 77-0 on February 7, 1973. I think, with some exceptions, that bipartisan attitude was preserved throughout the long and tedious proceedings. From time to time, there occurred conflicts and disagreements in the committee and between the respective staffs, but they usually were resolved. The final act of the Select Committee is to file its report, and I am pleased. It is not a perfect report. Some may say that it is without grace or style, and that is probably true. But it is the culmination of an extraordinary effort, and I am particularly gratified that the majority and minority staffs cooperated carefully in comparing their respective views and adjusting the text, so that in most instances a satisfactory joint staff position was submitted to the committee for adoption. The report is not adjudicatory, and indeed it often goes to some lengths to avoid finding fact in the traditional sense. This requirement was directed to the committee staff by the chairman, in deference, I believe, to the sensitivity of litigation in process or upcoming, and of course to the inquiry into impeachment by the House of Representatives. I commend the chairman for that point of view. In an historical perspective, I believe that the committee's principal service may have been in the public ventilation of the facts and circumstances collectively assembled under the title of Watergate. The committee's gathering and disseminating the often shocking, frequently embarrassing, and sometimes incriminating evidence and testimony before it certainly should exert a deterrent effect, and that effect may be far more important than the committee's recommendations. I rather suspect that it may be a long while before a future president permits the occurrence of such unfortunate circumstances. If that is the case, then the committee's laborious effort, the considerable expense, and the national frustration will have been worth the investment. I hope so. Recommendations. 1. Establishment of an Office of Public Prosecutor within the Department of Justice, appointed by the President for a fixed term and subject to Senate confirmation. The committee report recommends the creation of a judicially appointed permanent public attorney to investigate and prosecute cases in which there are conflicts of interest within the executive branch. This recommendation and my own evidence recognition that the federal government is poorly equipped for investigating and prosecuting crimes allegedly committed by high-ranking executive branch officials. Prior to the appointment of the Watergate Special Prosecutor, there did not exist within the Department of Justice a division solely and specifically entrusted with the authority to investigate allegations of official misconduct, cloaked with the requisite independence and statutory authority necessary for unimpeded access to government officials and documents. And I believe the investigation would have proceeded more rapidly and effectively had such an arrangement existed. Consequently, I agree in principle with the committee reports recommending the establishment of a permanent public prosecutor, possessing a statutory mandate to investigate and prosecute allegations of governmental misconduct. I have great doubts, however, regarding the constitutionality of the committee's proposal that the public attorney be appointed by the representatives of the judiciary. The appointment of a permanent public prosecutor within the Department of Justice for a fixed 6-year term, as nominated by the President and subject to Senate confirmation, possesses none of the potential constitutional infirmities presented by a judicially appointed public prosecutor, as were discussed in the Senate debate this past fall on the Hart-By Special Prosecutor Bill. Senator Percy and I, together with Senators Brock, Cook, and Young, introduced S. 2734 on November 20, 1973, that provided for the presidential appointment of a special Watergate prosecutor, subject to confirmation by the Senate. Senator Ervin, on June 17, 1974, introduced S. 3652, providing for presidential appointment of a permanent public prosecutor with Senate confirmation and a fixed term of 6 years. I believe both of these proposals avoid the constitutional pitfalls of the committee's recommendation and are attractive alternatives. 2. Establishment within the Congress of a Joint Intelligence Oversight Committee, so as to provide for increased congressional monitoring of governmental intelligence gathering activities. Both in the committee report and in other committee documents, there is found a substantial body of evidence regarding the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the National Security Agency, and other governmental intelligence gathering and/or investigative organizations, which provides insight into the activities, as well as the abuses, of these organizations relative to the matters under the Select Committee's perusal. Testimony was presented to the committee to the effect that there was an attempt by high-ranking White House officials to somehow involve the CIA in the Watergate cover-up, that the FBI investigation of the Watergate matter was impeded at the very highest levels of the Bureau itself, and that, under the supervision of the White House, intelligence gathering operations, including unlawful activity, were conducted outside the purview of the congressionally authorized intelligence and investigative agencies. Moreover, as indicated in separate committee documents, the CIA provided extensive logistical support to the participants in both the Fielding and Democratic National Committee break-ins and expressed a keen interest in the subsequent investigations. The intelligence-related material before the committee is not conclusive. It does not answer the question of what the President or other individuals knew or when they knew it. Nor does it explain why the Democratic National Committee headquarters twice was the target of an illegal entry. It seems apparent, however, that congressional committee oversight did not function effectively as a deterrent to those who may have sought to utilize governmental intelligence and investigative agencies for unlawful or unauthorized purposes. Thus, because of the cost, the secrecy, the lack of effective supervision, the uncertainty of domestic activities, and the extreme difficulty in obtaining access to classified materials, I am of the opinion that the subject of government intelligence operations requires extensive further examination. I wish to associate myself with the recommendation in the committee report for closer supervision of Central Intelligence Agency activities by the appropriate congressional oversight committees. I would go one step further and propose that the Congress should consider the creation of a special joint committee on intelligence activities. I believe the highly sensitive nature of intelligence operations, the expanding scope of the intelligence gathering requirement, and the enormous cost and dedication of manpower and resources to the intelligence undertaking in the United States fully justifies a new committee arrangement. Such a committee, not dissimilar to the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, could more effectively coordinate among the various intelligence investigative agencies now subject to congressional oversight than can the several committees now having partial oversight responsibilities. Thus, I believe that a joint committee would present no legitimate threat to the intelligence community in terms of jeopardizing or compromising their necessary intelligence operations, and would provide greater assurance that our intelligence gathering and investigative agencies are complying with the law and are working in the best interest of the nation. 3. Reformation of congressional investigatory hearing procedures so as to provide increased protection for the rights of individuals. Although this recommendation does not clearly fall within the province of Senate Resolution 60, the Select Committee hearings highlighted the fact that congressional investigatory proceedings exhibit a determination to ferret out the facts even if the investigative process may grievously injure the protective rights of individuals who are, or may become, defendants in judicial proceedings. Thus, I believe that Congress should give careful attention to the codification of rules of legislative hearing procedure so as to provide the same assurance that individual constitutional rights are not impaired by legislative hearings as the federal rules of criminal procedure provide in criminal proceedings. I believe that such rules should provide a mechanism whereby witnesses and proposed witnesses before legislative hearings who are or may be subject to criminal prosecution can be identified and afforded additional procedural protections than is now the case. For instance, a vulnerable witness might be given the right to have counsel participate in the questioning of other witnesses presenting testimony adverse to the interests of the vulnerable witness. In addition, the Congress should study the advisability of imposing common law and/or federal evidentiary rules in certain types, if not all, legislative hearings. Finally, the Congress may wish to establish a legislative public defender, whose duty would be to proctor legislative hearings and investigations so as to provide for the protection of the rights of individuals. As exemplified by the history of the Select Committee, the investigatory power of a congressional committee is extremely broad and pervasive, and in actuality is restricted only by the wording of the resolution or other legislative vehicle creating the committee and the authority of the committee to investigate such matters. While litigation and congressional discretion have provided some due process limitations upon congressional investigations, a congressional committee is not a jury nor a court, and common law and statutory evidentiary rules are not applicable to committee investigations. The most obvious example is hearsay testimony, which is recited throughout the committee report. Moreover, through its contempt power, use immunity, and public pressure, a congressional committee can, in many cases, indirectly overcome an individual's privilege against self-incrimination in a manner which could never occur in a court of law. As mentioned above, individuals whose conduct is being investigated often are not afforded the opportunity to have counsel cross-examine witnesses presenting testimony detrimental to them. Thus, while I will protect jealously the privilege and the right of congressional committees to conduct inquiries concerning the administration of existing laws as well as new statutes, I believe that legislation conveying the recognition of the need to protect the rights of potential defendants, the sanctity of criminal trials, and the impartiality of the impeachment process can be effected without constituting a detriment to a legislative committee's fact-finding power. 4. Campaign and electoral reforms. Among the several inadequacies in our political process highlighted by Watergate, none is more glaring than the need for comprehensive campaign and electoral reform. The types of campaign abuses prevalent during the 1972 campaigns, though shocking in terms of their scope, were by no means unprecedented. The fact of the matter is, and has been, that political campaigns take place in a legal vacuum. With the possible exception of the Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971, there has been no significant attempt by Congress to regulate political campaigns since the Corrupt Practices Act of 1925, and even that was more loophole than law. Thus, it is not surprising that campaigns have taken on the appearance of a political free-for-all, in which the distinction between illegal, unethical, and immoral conduct is generally obscured. The fallout from that atmosphere is cumulative, and has resulted in a devastating erosion of public trust and confidence in the process by which public officials are elected. Moreover, if the country is to benefit from the experience of the past 2 years, it is essential that the Congress undertake fundamental reform of the electoral process, reform which includes not only campaign finance, but also various aspects of the actual election process. The type of reform most vital, and about which the Select Committee assembled a wealth of data, was campaign finance. From a financial standpoint, the 1972 campaign for president was no different from past campaigns in that there was no effective regulation of the source, form, or amount of political contributions. Although the Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971 required more complete disclosure of contributions, the 1972 campaign was still largely funded through a system of unrestricted, large-sum private financing. It was this system that permitted one individual to give $2 million, while over 200 million people did not contribute. This system gave rise to the allegations that the milk producers received an increase in the support price of milk in return for the pledge of large contributions. It was this system which permitted individuals to launder cash through Mexico in an effort to suppress the identity of the source. And finally, it was this system which permitted the accumulation of $350,000 in a White House safe, none of which was reported, and most of which, purportedly, was dispersed for political espionage and alleged hush money. Consequently, it is not surprising that considerable support has developed within the country and the Congress for complete abandonment of this system in favor of substantial public financing. I can sympathize with that view, for public financing certainly appears pure and absolute, but it is not the answer. Although public financing probably would solve a limited number of problems afflicting the present process, it would almost certainly create an equal number of potentially greater dangers. Some of those would stem, no doubt, from the incestuous nature of the government's financing the process by which it is selected. The responsiveness portion of the Select Committee's report details the repeated efforts of members of the administration to influence or abuse the various departments and agencies for purely political purposes. Would it not be possible under a system of public financing, in which an arm of the government was responsible for allocating funds, to abuse that authority on behalf of one candidate or party under the guise of bureaucratic red tape? Some would argue that it is overly cynical to make such an assumption, but perhaps it would have been cynical a few years ago to assume that an administration would try to actively utilize its broad powers to punish political adversaries. We can ill afford to overlook the possibility of such an incident in the public financing sector 10 or 20 years from now. Another serious problem with comprehensive public financing, in my judgment, is the effect it will have upon the individual's First Amendment right of freedom of political expression. I believe that right gives each citizen the right of expressing himself politically, whether by contribution or otherwise, or conversely, refraining from such expression. And in a nation which prides itself on protecting individual rights, the option to refrain from exercising that right must be considered as vital as the right itself. I, therefore, urge that it is essential to maintain participation in our political process on a voluntary basis, while attempting to increase the opportunities and incentives to participate. Public financing, however, provides no such choice. Rather, it states that the need to eliminate the influence of large-sum contributors and special interests is so compelling that we must abandon the use of all voluntary private financing in favor of mandatory public financing. And in the case of the latter, we have no control over which candidate receives our tax dollars, nor whether they are actually used for that purpose. In fact, taxpayers would be directly supporting candidates whom they consider repugnant. If it were merely a question of unrestricted private financing or comprehensive public financing, then I would support the latter. But there is a third, more reasonable option, which would retain some continuity while avoiding some of the hazards of public financing. That option is a system of effectively regulated private financing, in which the incentives for small contributions are vastly enhanced. Such a system is in essence what the Select Committee recommends. A strict limitation on the size, amount, and form of private contributions, a single campaign committee, a single campaign depository, an overall expenditure limitation, a requirement for full public disclosure before rather than after the election, and an independent elections commission are all necessary reforms which would impose order upon the current campaign chaos. Moreover, I would make one further recommendation which would do more to eliminate distortive influence of special interests than any other single action, and that is to prohibit altogether contributions from any and all organizations. Only individuals can vote, and I believe only individuals should be permitted to contribute. Some have argued, however, that if we eliminate the financial influence of the special interests and strictly limit the size of individual contributions, we cannot effectively fund a competitive two-party system. Indeed, without some new incentives for millions of Americans to make small contributions, such a system would clearly discourage constructive opposition and tend to bolster the inherent advantages of incumbency. Thus, I would propose a 100% tax credit on all contributions made in a calendar year up to $50 on an individual return and $100 on a joint return. Such a credit would enable each taxpayer to divert up to $50 of his tax money to a candidate or candidates if, and only if, he desires to do so. This approach would be entirely voluntary, thereby protecting the individual's freedom of political expression. Moreover, it would generate sufficient funds so that we might avoid having to resort to the direct appropriation of tax monies for political purposes. A realistic and effective tax incentive, combined with the aforementioned list of statutory reforms, would afford a fair and competitive means of funding political campaigns. I am convinced further that we cannot hope to reverse the current trend of erosion of public trust and confidence without sharply increasing public participation in the political process. In that regard, I would urge that serious consideration be given automatic registration of voters in federal elections at age 18. The history of the United States has been a history of the extension of the voting franchise. Yet even today, a significant number of our citizens are effectively prevented from participating in elections by complex and often archaic registration and residency requirements. The postcard voter registration bill passed by the Senate last year was an effort to deal with this problem, but I opposed it because of my concern for the potential for mail fraud and abuse of such a system. Several Western nations have already successfully implemented a form of automatic voter registration. In the Scandinavian countries, for example, and in Switzerland, every eligible citizen is registered ex officio in a voting register. A list of voters is published by the election authorities in advance of the election date. Any citizen whose name has not been included in the list then has until approximately a week before the election to correct the situation. In the United States, however, citizens still must contend with what amounts to a perpetual registration process. I fully realize that some difficulties will arise in translating automatic registration to the realities of the American experience and attempting to reconcile it with state registration procedures. Perhaps Social Security numbers could be utilized to standardize this procedure, since more than 95% of eligible voters are already registered with Social Security. In any event, the concept deserves consideration, in my view, and, if workable, it could provide a valuable incentive to increase citizen participation. I would also urge major reform of our present spasmodic system of presidential primaries. There are essentially three alternatives in this regard: a refinement of the present system requiring the 25 states who hold presidential primaries to do so on 4 or 5 specific dates at 2 or 3 week intervals, a single national primary for each party with a subsequent runoff unless one candidate polls more than 40%, and a system of regional primaries also held at specific intervals, but encompassing all of the country. Of these three proposals, I am most inclined to support the one for a system of regional primaries, in which every eligible voter who desires to participate in the election of a party nominee can do so by voting in the regional primary which includes his state. This would permit the millions of Americans who support candidates who will not receive the party nomination to express that support in a meaningful way. It would also give them a personal stake in the election and increase the likelihood of their participation in the subsequent general election campaign. Specifically, I would propose dividing the country into 4 geographic regions, largely along the lines of time zones, so as to avoid holding a Southern or a New England primary with a distinct ideological slant. I would make those regions of roughly equal population and would hold the 4 primaries at 3-week intervals, beginning in early June and ending in early August. The respective primary candidates would compete for state delegates, who would be won according to the proportion of vote received in each state, rather than on a winner-take-all basis. Although I am aware of the high cost involved in running regional primaries, the basic idea is to vastly expand the public participation in the nominating process, and to significantly reduce the official length of presidential campaigns. As it is now, the first presidential primary normally takes place in early March, with the general election 8 months later in November. But, as I see it, there is absolutely no reason why that process must take that long. It exhausts the candidates, costs exorbitant sums of money, and eventually bores a great many people. I would propose that all primaries for federal office be held no earlier than the 1st of June and no later than the 15th of August. This would significantly shorten the official length of campaigns for federal office and permit the Congress to work at relatively full strength for 4 months before most members are forced to return to their states or districts to campaign full-time for the nomination. I also recommend that we open and close polls all across the country at a uniform time, and that they be open a full 24 hours. The arguments for this are simple and well known, but briefly stated, this is the best way I know of to prevent the harmful effects of broadcast networks projecting the outcomes of elections based on very early returns when polls in the western states are still open. Moreover, 24 hours would maximize the individual's opportunity to vote before, after, or during work. I further recommend that the presidential electoral system be made more responsive and representative by the abolition of the Electoral College, that 18th century vestigial remnant of constitutional compromise. I personally favor, and have always supported, the direct election of the president by popular vote, but having unsuccessfully urged that move, I am willing to settle for an improvement, if not a cure, for this situation. I propose that Congress and the states fully debate the merits of popular vote, congressional district vote, proportional allocation of electoral votes by states according to the popular vote, or any other electoral process calculated to eliminate what I view as the most onerous elements of the present system. That is to say, 1. The winner-take-all by state process, which created and perpetuated the one-party South for a century after the Civil War, and 2nd, the possibility of the selection of the president by the House of Representatives, which constitutes the most undemocratic of all the allocation systems. Some say that the reform of the Electoral College is not related to the mandate of Senate Resolution 60, but I disagree. I think that the sensitivity of the electoral system, the coherence of the selection process, the vitality of the two-party system, and the integrity of financial support are essential to the political prosperity of the country and are paramount in their importance to every other democratic consideration. 5. The institution of the presidency. I believe there exists a fundamental infirmity in the relationship of the chief magistrate of the nation to the two other coordinate branches of government. This development is not of recent origin. It has matured steadily since at least the beginning of the 20th century, and at an accelerated pace since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The presidency has become splendid, and it has become increasingly isolated. Surrounded by the trappings of privilege and the sanctuary of security, both national and personal, the presidency is indeed the most equal of all the equal branches. Its jurisdiction and the scope and sweep of its powers are enormous and broad. While it may be that gradually grafting onto the presidency of additional powers and authorities is a natural development in the evolution of our democracy, there are certain elements of what has come to be known as a strong presidency that I do not believe to be desirable. In recent years, the president's personal staff has served as his council of advisors, and in some instances, the primary delegates of presidential authority. This is counter to the historical concept of the cabinet system, where the president's cabinet served as his principal advisors, in addition to being the administrators of the several departments of the government. By way of example, under Article 2, Section 2, the president is empowered constitutionally to require the written opinion of the principal officer in the executive departments. I think that the original cabinet system is preferable to a plethora of presidential counselors, White House counselors, special advisors, and the like. The cross-pollination that occurs in councils of individuals operating from independent bases of jurisdictional authority is distinctly preferable to the highly structured, closely supervised, personal staff. Strong persons in strong positions are a significant force for good or evil, and I believe that the opportunity for good is greatly expanded and the possibility of a yes-man syndrome is greatly diminished in the cabinet situation. The underutilization of the resources and personnel of the Department of Justice and almost complete reliance upon the White House legal staff is another recent development which I consider to be unfortunate. I believe it essential that there be one arm of the executive branch that is the primary legal authority, and which is responsible for providing the entire administration, including the President, with objective legal advice. I propose that the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice be formally charged with the responsibility to serve as legal counsel to the President. I have come to believe, notwithstanding my earlier support for the ratification of the 22nd Amendment, that we made a mistake in limiting a president to 2 terms, and that the 22nd Amendment should be repealed. I believe that the discipline of standing for re-election, or at least contemplating the possibility of standing for re-election, is a desirable one, and that the nature of the presidency is materially altered by the constitutional limitation of 2 terms. I think the incumbency factor, which is much vaunted and highly prized by political observers, is overstated in the first instance, but that it would be diminished by the repeal of the 22nd Amendment. After all, incumbency is less regal if one must at least consider the possibility of standing for re-election 4 years hence. In short, the atmosphere engendered by the removal of political pressures from a president who has been re-elected to his 2nd term presents, in my opinion, far greater potential for abuse of power than a situation in which an incumbent president always is presented with the opportunity to seek re-election. As for most public issues, we have spawned our share of cliches, and one of the favorites describes the chief magistrate as an imperial president, implying isolation, arrogance, and non-responsiveness. While I may not subscribe to all the elements of that characterization, I do feel that separation of powers has become more than a constitutional doctrine. It has become a geographic fact. Although the nature of the presidency certainly is influenced by the individual occupant, interaction between the executive and the legislative departments, and with the public, is not only desirable, but essential. I have often proposed that the president should maintain an office in the Capitol, and that the president, or at least some of his principal staff, should occupy that office from time to time, and be available to legislators on matters of mutual interest. Certainly the single most notable evidentiary achievement of the Select Committee was the revelation by Alexander Butterfield of the tape recording system utilized in the presidential offices in both the White House and the Executive Office Building. I am not sure I understand why the tape recording facilities were installed, but I find the practice objectionable and not in keeping with the grandeur of the presidency. I rather suspect that recent experiences will mitigate against that practice in the future. In any event, I believe that Congress should consider carefully a prohibition of the electronic recording of conversations occurring both in rooms and on telephones, except with the express prior consent of all the participants to the conversation, or unless carefully supervised by a court of competent jurisdiction for specified statutory purposes. 6. Increase National Party Committee role in federal elections. Finally, I believe Watergate might never have occurred had there been more politics instead of less in the White House. Politics is an honorable profession. It is probably a free citizen's highest secular calling. The Republic could not function without the dedication of millions of citizen politicians, and consequently, I hope that politics as an honorable undertaking is not a casualty of Watergate. I urge that our young people, who are easily the best educated, most aware, and the most participatory of any generation, involve themselves in the politics of the nation. The two-party system must flourish as a system of two broad-based national parties, each able to accommodate the wide variety of viewpoints and ideas, and to synthesize the majority view on any given election day. I think presidential and vice presidential campaigns, in particular, ought to be the responsibility of the national party structure, and not temporary collateral organizations, such as the Committee to Re-elect the President. I take great pride in noting after these extended hearings that neither the Republican National Committee nor the Democratic National Committee were involved in campaign illegalities in any way, nor were their chairmen or principal officers. Both our parties are great parties, and they are essential to the functioning of the country. End of section 29. Section 30 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Section 30, Chapter 11, Individual Views of the Senators of the Select Committee, Part 3. Mr. Daniel K. Inouye, U.S. Senator from the state of Hawaii, and Mr. Joseph M. Montoya, U.S. Senator from the state of New Mexico. Despite the fact that there is no unanimity among the members of the committee as to the constitutionality, advisability, and practicality of providing public financing of presidential and other federal campaigns, there is a consensus in the U.S. Senate and among the public at large in favor of such reform of our electoral system. We count ourselves part of that consensus. The testimony and evidence made public during our hearings document the inherent potential for abuse and corruption in any campaign financing system that is dependent upon a small number of large private contributors. Unfortunately, a cure for these abuses which would place strict limitations upon campaign contributions and expenditures would produce an equally unfair system. Such limitations have the inevitable effect of increasing the existing advantages of the major political parties and well-known individuals, that is, incumbent office holders, who have greater access and appeal to donors over minor parties and unknown individuals who wish to enter the political arena. An open, fair, and honest campaign financing system must combine effective and timely public disclosure of the sources of campaign dollars, realistic limitations upon contributions and expenditures in campaigns, and an efficient method for increasing citizen participation in the financing of campaigns. In his State of the Congress address of February 6, 1974, Majority Leader Mansfield stated, "We shall not finally come to grips with the problems of our campaign methods, except as we are prepared to pay for the public business of elections with public funds." The Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, in its favorable report on S. 3044, the Federal Election Campaign Act amendments of 1974, which passed the Senate on April 11, 1974, by a 53-32 vote, stated, "The election of federal officials is not a private affair. It is the foundation of our government." Senate approval of a comprehensive system of public financing of federal elections, as shown in the vote for S. 3044, is but the latest in a number of successful legislative measures designed to bring public dollars into the electoral arena in order to offset the corrupting reliance on large private contributors. For public financing of campaigns is not a new idea. In fact, it is not new law. Public financing measures are now on the books at the national level in the form of the dollar tax checkoff and tax credits and deductions for small political contributions, and in many states. The constitutionality of these measures stands unchallenged. Congress adopted both the checkoff and the tax incentive in 1971. It is important to look at the actual results since then. For critics of public financing have sometimes attempted to interpret the early response as demonstrating lack of popular support for the idea. We believe that the opposite is in fact true. In 2 short years, the American people have shown that given the chance, they are very willing to support this important innovation. In 1972, the first year it was in effect, 3.1% of all tax returns filed were checked off, producing the first $3 million to $4 million for the new presidential election campaign fund. Anyone who says this was an inauspicious beginning must be reminded that the checkoff was in effect hidden on a separate tax form, was unseen by most taxpayers, and that virtually no public education was undertaken to explain the new system and how it worked. As a result of congressional pressure, the IRS remedied this major flaw last summer, requiring that the checkoff be placed visibly on page 1 of the IRS Form 1040 for 1973 and thereafter. In addition, after a court challenge, citizens who failed to use the checkoff in 1972 were given a second chance. As a result, a special make-up checkoff box was placed on the 1973 returns. The response? More than 15% of the 1973 returns used the checkoff, designating $17,575,054 for the presidential fund. This 15% equals over 1/4 of those who actually voted in the 1972 presidential election. The current IRS projections indicate that there will ultimately be at least $29 million in the fund by the end of the year. And, if taxpayers continue to check off at a rate no higher than this year, it will mean at least $64 million in the fund in time for the 1976 presidential election. Moreover, taxpayers are rapidly becoming aware that dollars checked off do not mean additional taxes. Instead, they represent an authorization for Congress to appropriate for the presidential election campaign fund the amount checked off. Given the degree of public cynicism about all politics this spring, a 15% checkoff rate may well represent the bottom rather than the top line of public support. If the number of those checking off increases, as we are convinced it will, with greater citizen education and understanding, so will the amount of money appropriated by the people to promote open, honest elections. The voluntary fund is clearly an excellent way to provide a broader system of public financing for qualified federal candidates. Tax incentives and, if necessary, general revenues are additional and legitimate sources for public campaign funding. We do not share the concern expressed by the majority of the committee over using Treasury funds for public elections. Tax credits and deductions are methods of public financing of campaigns that merely bypass tax collection. We are not adverse to continued or expanded use of tax incentives to aid in paying for national campaigns, and after further study, the Congress may well wish to change the Internal Revenue Code to strengthen inducements for campaign contributions. We do believe that any candidate or party which receives public funds should be required to manifest significant public support. A system of matching private contributions with public money, such as provided in S. 3044, meets this requirement. It also maintains the element of individual initiative that is so essential to the democratic process. We have only to look around us to see that public financing is a major new political issue, that it may become the most important new aspect of our continuing experiment in democracy. The current activity of many public officials and citizen organizations in debating methods and mechanism of public financing indicates a realization that not all, or even most, of the problems of our current election system can be solved by more criminal laws, more controls, and limits on political activity. We are faced with the need to change not just the rules, but the framework within which our elections and campaigns are conducted. Public financing is no panacea itself, of course, and its staunchest advocates are the first to note that it raises its own new and different questions. What public financing can do, however, is move us one step closer toward that goal which we must always and continually pursue: open, fair, honest elections, in which the ideas of citizens and candidates compete regardless of the size of their pocketbooks. With the energy and good faith this country brings to its biggest problems, we can devise an equitable system of public financing that will help treat an illness evident in the Watergate tragedy that goes to the heart of this democracy. Mr. Edward J. Gurney, U.S. Senator from the state of Florida. I am in basic agreement with the thrust of the report. However, I do point out that because the bulk of the report came in during the July 4th recess of the Senate, and the last portions within hours of the deadline time of submission of these views, there has not been sufficient time to review the report thoroughly. There are observations and judgments in the report with which I disagree, and I feel sure that there would be other points of disagreement had there been time to go over this voluminous 3,000-page report. The investigation clearly reveals that there was a scheme and an organized effort, participated in by persons in high official places in this administration, to obtain political intelligence by breaking and entering into Democratic National Committee headquarters. There is, however, a dispute in the evidence as to who was responsible for putting this plan into operation and who knew about the Watergate break-in and when. This is a matter that should be determined by the judicial branch of our government. The testimony and documents presented to the committee also clearly shows that there was a conspiracy to cover up the Watergate break-in, and that certain persons at the White House were involved in that conspiracy. The evidence is clear as to the part played by some characters in this tragedy, and unclear as to what others may have done. It was not the mission of the Select Committee, pursuant to Senate Joint Resolution 60, to place responsibility for individual criminal acts. The committee had an important responsibility in its efforts to uncover the salient facts surrounding the Watergate break-in and cover-up and other improper activities occurring in the 1972 election campaign. By exposing these unethical, improper, and illegal political campaign practices to the American electorate, we have provided the necessary groundwork to bring about a strong demand for needed political campaign reform. As a consequence, the Senate has already enacted a far-reaching campaign reform bill, which is now under consideration in the House. Despite reservations which many of us held at the outset and the possibilities of prejudicial effect upon subsequent criminal actions, I believe that the televising of the hearings served a very useful purpose. Overnight, the whole country became jurors as well as spectators in the unfolding drama. The American people were permitted to observe everything which transpired: the questions and answers, the witnesses' responses, the actions and attitudes of the panel of senators and their staffs. I think, too, that by televising our proceedings, we counteracted prejudicial selectivity by the media of the material presented to the committee. I do believe, however, that we spent too much time on the hearings, especially on testimony from witnesses of minor importance to the investigation, and on certain matters like the burglary of the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, which were not germane to our inquiry. It is obvious that, while it could not confine itself to strict evidentiary rules, the committee did permit too much unsubstantiated evidence to enter the record. Because of the impact of the hearings upon millions of Americans who watched their progress on television or read newspaper accounts of what was happening, I believe we should have exercised greater discretion in handling hearsay testimony. I was also troubled by the continual leaking of information from the committee. It was not unusual to find that matters which transpired in executive session appeared in the headlines the next morning. Permitting highly prejudicial matters to be disclosed to the media reflected badly upon the manner in which the United States Senate conducted this important and highly sensitive investigation. I agree emphatically that political spying should be purged from the American political scene. I consider that the committee's exposure of the machinations involved in the Watergate affair will help to eliminate dirty tricks as an accepted political campaign practice. It must be emphasized that, from our own political experience and from the evidence we have received concerning this one notorious political affair, we know that this administration or the Republican Party does not have a monopoly on dirty tricks or other illegal campaign activities. It should be pointed out, and it is clear from the evidence, that the abuses of 1972 were committed by a few misguided individuals, over-ambitious and overzealous in their efforts on behalf of certain candidates and causes. The wrongdoing was not the work of the Republican Party or its professional campaign staff. The vast majority of people who worked in the 1972 presidential campaigns, Republican or Democrat, worked in honorable fashion for their candidates, with no knowledge nor use of any Watergate-type activities. I have strongly supported efforts to reform the campaign laws, and the experience of the recent presidential campaign demonstrates the need to enforce these laws consistently and strenuously. The most pervasive abuse of 1972 was the careless handling of cash contributions, which should be barred from future elections. This matter was common to both political parties, but it was to a lesser extent a problem for the Democrats, since the Republican Party held the White House and was heavily favored to win re-election, and so, inevitably, attracted more money. I favor a simplified codification of federal and state election statutes, to which the candidates and the public can readily refer. We have enough laws on the books to deal with illegal campaign practices, but we desperately need a handy guidebook for campaign staff members of candidates for public office. I am totally opposed to the committee's recommendation for a public attorney with prosecutorial powers outside of the executive branch of the government. The President of the United States must be held responsible for the business of the executive branch, including prosecution of criminals. It is his constitutional duty, and his alone, to faithfully execute the laws of the land. I oppose the creation of a czar who could literally hound and intimidate governmental officials in the proper exercise of their responsibilities. Criticisms directed at certain officials for their handling of the Watergate investigations reflect dissatisfaction with individuals rather than with institutions. I do favor, however, the establishment of an office within the Department of Justice charged with investigating alleged campaign law violations and prosecuting wrongdoers. See Attachment A for legal argument. Finally, I must add that I was utterly appalled by the revelations of Watergate, and I deplore the performance of individuals employed by or connected with the Committee to Re-elect the President, which the committee's hearings have brought to light. Of course, we cannot legislate goodness, reform mankind, or alter the ethical standards of individuals. But I believe that the Select Committee's findings relative to the 1972 presidential campaign will profoundly affect the actions and attitudes of political partisans in future campaigns. I hope that a genuine post-Watergate morality will prevail in the political life of our country. I hope, too, that the committee's investigations of the Watergate break-in and cover-up and the prosecutions that have been generated by our inquiry will deter future administrations, Republican or Democrat, from indulging in illegal practices and improper conduct in their quest for victory and political power. I wish to express my personal appreciation to my colleagues on the committee, with whom I have been fortunate to labor in this important task, and to whom I have been able to express freely my views over the past 16 months. Attachment A. Legal argument against the establishment of an independent public attorney. The recommendation for a public attorney with prosecutorial powers outside of the executive branch is unprecedented in our constitutional history. Its unprecedented nature is a forceful reminder of the constitutional problems inherent in such a blend of the traditional separate roles of the prosecutor and the judiciary. It violates the principle of separation of powers. It is at odds with the judicial function of the federal courts as provided in Article 3, and it does not comport with due process. The Constitution provides, in Article 2, Section 3, that the President is charged with the responsibility of ensuring that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed. Thus, the function of conducting legal proceedings on behalf of the United States cannot be transferred to a prosecutor who is wholly independent of the executive branch. Professor Saul Bater of the Harvard Law School has written, "The Constitution vests executive power in the President and commands him to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The enforcement of the federal criminal law is a central part of the function of executing the laws. For the Congress, or anyone else, to purport to create an agency wholly independent from the executive branch, with power to enforce the criminal law, would probably be unconstitutional." New York Times, May 5, 1973. In Ponzi v. Fessenden, 258 U.S. 254, 262, 1922, the Supreme Court rules that the prosecution of offenses against the United States is an executive function stemming from the power vested in the President by Article 2 of the Constitution, the discharge of which is committed to the Attorney General. The Attorney General is the head of the Department of Justice. He is the hand of the President in taking care that the laws of the United States, in protection of the interests of the United States in legal proceedings and in the prosecution of offenses, be faithfully executed. Similarly, in Springer v. Philippine Islands, 277 U.S. 189-202, 1928, the Supreme Court declared that the authority to enforce laws or to appoint the agents charged with the duty of enforcing them are executive functions. See also 2 Opinion A.G. 482, 487-493, 1831. In United States v. Cox, 342 Federal 2nd 167, 5th Circuit, certiorari denied, 85 Supreme Court 1767, 1965, the Court of Appeals held that a United States attorney could not be required by a court to sign an indictment initiating the prosecution of offenses against the United States. In addressing the constitutional authority of the executive branch in the enforcement of criminal laws, the court reiterated the principle of Ponzi, supra, that the Attorney General is the hand of the President in taking care that the laws of the United States in legal proceedings and in the prosecution of offenses be faithfully executed. 342 Federal 2nd at 171. It then considered the role of the U.S. Attorney in discharging this executive power. The U.S. Attorney is an executive official of the government, and it is as an officer of the executive department that he exercises a discretion as to whether or not there shall be a prosecution in a particular case. It follows, as an incident of the constitutional separation of powers, that the courts are not to interfere with the free exercise of the discretionary powers of the attorneys of the United States in their control over criminal prosecutions. Thus, the court ruled that to transfer the power which is committed to the executive to determine whether to prosecute to another body, the grand jury, would be in derogation of Article 2, which grants to the President all executive power and vests in him the responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Similarly, in Newman v. United States, 382 Federal 2nd 479, D.C. Circuit 1967, the court held that the lower court had no authority to review decisions of the prosecutor, and that it is not the function of the judiciary to review the exercise of executive discretion. 382 Federal 2nd at 487. Rejecting the suggestion in a concurring opinion that irrational decisions might be reviewable, the court said, "The Constitution places on the executive the duty to see that the laws are faithfully executed, and the responsibility must reside with that power." Idem No. 9. The same principle applies with equal force to prohibit transfer of the power to prosecute offenses to an independent prosecutor or commission outside the executive branch. Finally, it should also be noted that the resolution authorizing the appointment of a special prosecutor during the Teapot Dome scandal provides no precedent for the appointment of public attorney. Prior to the introduction of the resolution in that instance, President Coolidge had suggested the appointment of special counsel B. Nagel, Teapot Dome, page 92, and the language of the resolution itself recognized the authority of the President to make the appointment. Senate Joint Resolution 54, February 8, 1924. End of Section 30. Section 31 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3, Section 31, Chapter 11, Individual Views of the Senators of the Select Committee, Part 4. Mr. Lowell P. Weicker, Jr., U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut. A stillness. In the early 1970s, several independent events took place in the United States of America. On the surface, they appeared to lack a common bond. In June of 1969, a Lewis Harris poll found that 25% of all Americans felt they had a moral right to disregard a victim's cry for help. Over the next several years, this mood took the form of countless incidents of looking the other way when men and women were assaulted and murdered in full view of entire neighborhoods. On May 4, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, a group of students who refused an order to disperse were fired upon by the National Guard, killing William Schroeder, Sandy Scheuer, Jeffrey Miller, and Allison Krauss, and wounding 9 others. 10 days later, at Jackson State University in Mississippi, police who had been called in to protect firemen from violence opened a 28-second fusillade into and around a dormitory, killing Philip Gibbs and James Earl Green and wounding 12 others. During 1971, a decision was reached by the administration to conduct the president's re-election campaign with a special committee totally separate and insulated from the political party which would re-nominate that president. In early 1972, a young radio reporter in Miami stood outside a supermarket trying to get people to sign a copy of the Bill of Rights. 75% refused, many saying it was communist propaganda. In February of 1972, it was revealed that International Telephone and Telegraph had allegedly offered a campaign contribution of $400,000 in return for the Justice Department dropping an antitrust suit against ITT. The suit was dropped on presidential order, but when the Attorney General was questioned about the president's role by a Senate committee in March, he lied. On June 17, 1972, burglars employed by the Committee to Re-elect the President were arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee with bugging equipment and large sums of cash. In December of 1972, having failed to obtain congressional approval for a reorganization of the cabinet, the administration moved autonomously to establish 3 or 4 super secretaries and to place various executive office employees in key sub-cabinet posts. The obvious goal was to create a White House-directed network of decision-making and reporting quite apart from the formal cabinet structure, which remains subject to congressional scrutiny. In February of 1973, the White House held a Peace with Honor reception to celebrate the end of the Vietnam War. Only those congressmen who had supported the president's Vietnam policies were invited, implying that those who had questioned our involvement in Vietnam were either against peace or were dishonorable. Some of these incidents were matters of life and death and were well publicized. Others were matters of principle and were little noticed at the time. In each instance, a significant outrage had taken place. What was common to all? In each instance, no one complained. A constitutional stillness was over the land. The uproar. American decency, idealism, honesty, and reverence for the Constitution that some had thought bought off has been stirring and reasserting itself for many months now. Yes, a few still cry treason when questions are asked. A few still espouse the end as justifying the means. A few still goggle at an American title rather than the title of American. But it was only yesterday, June 17, 1972 to be specific, that today's few were a part of a large American majority. Why the turnaround? The truth. Because Frank Wills discovered taped doors at the Watergate, America's doors didn't close in all our faces. Constitutional democracy in the era of Watergate. For this senator, Watergate is not a whodunit. It is a documented, proven attack on laws, institutions, and principles. The response to that attack was and is a nation of laws at work, determining whether men shall prevail over the principles of a constitutional democracy. It has been and will be the testing of a great experiment in government begun some 200 years ago. Laws, institutions, and principles were squarely before this committee, to be debated, probed, and documented, in order to assert remedies and to reassert time-honored concepts. Guilt or innocence was not an issue. This was a fact-finding body. It was a legislative body, and those duties go to the heart of what Watergate was all about. In keeping with the committee's duties, this is a report of facts and evidence leading to legislative recommendations. To document the abuse of laws, institutions, and principles, the facts and evidence are presented, first as they bear on the basis of our laws, the Constitution, second as they relate to the institutions of our government, and third as they affect the principles of our political system. 1. The Constitution. One of the most disturbing facts about the testimony presented to this committee is that so much of it went relentlessly to the heart of our Constitution. To appreciate what happened to the Constitution, it is useful to divide the 7 articles and 26 amendments into substantive versus procedural provisions. The substantive sections lay out rights, powers, and duties. The procedural areas address somewhat more technical and administrative matters. The important point is that the essence and strength of the Constitution springs from its substantive areas, primarily the first 3 articles, the first 10 amendments, and the 14th Amendment. Evidence presented to this committee can and will demonstrate that every major substantive part of the Constitution was violated, abused, and undermined during the Watergate period. It is a record built entirely on the words of the participants themselves. Tragically, it focuses on the most prodigious article of the Constitution, Article 2, which sets out the powers and duties of the executive. It includes the most significant individual rights guaranteed by the first 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights. And it encompasses the 5th and 14th Amendments' guarantees of due process of law, the foundation of our system of justice. A. The Executive. Of all the issues confronting the Constitutional Convention at Philadelphia, the nature of the presidency ranked as one of the most important. Indeed, the resolution of that issue is often cited as one of the most significant actions taken. Most state constitutions prior to that time had weak executives and strong legislatures. The decision to create a president as opposed to plural administrators was a reluctant recognition of the advantages of a strong executive. Nevertheless, the convention took steps to contain presidential power. Only after deciding the method of selecting a president, his term, mode of removal, and powers of duties, did the convention agree to the concept of a strong president. This bit of history, indicating that the delineation of the president's office and powers preceded the creation of his position in the constitutional scheme, is quite important. It demonstrates that executive power is to be exercised within the framework of the Constitution, and particularly within the guidelines of Article 2, which lays out the powers and duties of that office. This is much of what Watergate is all about, and it bears a close look at Article 2. The issue at stake is the exercise of potentially awesome presidential power. As to that issue, Article 2 contains 2 points of significance. First, its opening words state, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." This grant of executive authority, with no words of limitation, has, from the time of Jefferson, been the basis for expanding the presidential office and activities. However, the initial broad authority is offset by a second significant factor, the enumeration of executive powers later in Article 2. These declare, in part, that the president is to be commander-in-chief, make treaties, appoint ambassadors and other officers, grant pardons, and take care that the laws are faithfully executed. It is worth noting that experience has eventually placed limits on the general powers. The president has been allowed, as a practical matter, to exercise those additional powers that fall naturally within his range of activities. The important point, however, is that no president has been, or can be, allowed to conduct the executive branch in conflict with the Constitution taken as a whole, and certainly not in conflict with express sections of the Constitution, such as the Bill of Rights, or Article 1, the legislature, or Article 3, the judiciary. This, then, is the proper context for examining facts. Article 2 of the Constitution, by which the presidency was created, was violated from beginning to end by Watergate. There is massive evidence of misuse of the awesome general powers that reside in the executive department. There is equal evidence documenting abuses of the enumerated duties. 1. General powers and duties. The facts show an executive office that approved a master intelligence plan containing proposals that were specifically identified as illegal, that proposed setting up a private intelligence firm with a black bag or breaking and entering capability as secret investigative support for the White House, that set up its own secret police, that used its clandestine police force to violate the rights of American citizens, that hired a private eye to spy on its enemies, including their personal lives, domestic problems, drinking habits, social activities, and sexual habits, that circulated an enemies list, that developed plans to use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies, that knew of an illegal break-in connected with the Ellsberg case and concealed that fact rather than report it to appropriate authorities, that used a presidential increase in milk support prices to get $5,000 from the milk producers to pay for the Ellsberg break-in, that recruited persons for that break-in on the false pretense of national security, that offered the presiding judge in the Ellsberg trial the FBI directorship at a clandestine meeting in the midst of the trial, that ordered a warrantless wiretap on a news columnist's telephone, that wiretapped 17 newsmen and government officials in an operation that was outside proper investigative channels, that suggested firebombing the Brookings Institute, that set up an intelligence evaluation committee outside the legitimate intelligence community to disseminate information that should have been restricted to individual agencies, that used the Secret Service to wiretap the president's brother, that kept $350,000 in leftover 1968 campaign funds in a safe in the Chief of Staff's office, that used most of those funds as hush money for the Watergate burglars, that approved a large contribution from the Milk Producers Association after being told it was meant to gain access to and favors from the White House, that received and passed on information about an IRS audit of one of the president's friends, that arranged for a tax attorney for that friend, that contacted the IRS as well as the Justice Department in a number of other tax cases involving friends of the president, that planned and possibly carried out a break-in at the office of a Las Vegas publisher, that suggested a break-in at the apartment of the man who attempted to assassinate Governor Wallace, that contemplated a break-in at the Potomac Associates offices, that tried to rewrite history by making up bogus State Department cables to falsely connect the Kennedy administration with the assassination of President Diem, that attempted to get reporter William Lambert to use the phony cables in a story, that tried to plant false stories connecting the president's opponent with communist money and the crimes alleged in the Ellsberg case, that installed an elaborate system of taping conversations between the president and his staff or visitors, that told federal investigators to stay out of the Ellsberg matter, that undertook a clandestine operation to hide a key witness in the ITT case in a Denver hospital, where she was interrogated by Howard Hunt in disguise, that authorized and funded from within the White House a dirty tricks operation including scurrilous literature, late-night telephone campaigns, and advertising designed to offend local interests, seemingly sponsored by Democratic candidates, and physical disruptions directed against presidential opponents, that planted spies, hecklers, and pickets in the Muskie and Humphrey campaigns, that participated in discussions of a campaign against Democrats to include prostitutes, mugging, kidnapping, bugging, and burglary, that pressed for adoption of Liddy's Watergate plan, that was told of the authorization and budget for Liddy's plan, that believed it had received transcripts of illegal wiretaps and never reported that crime, that was warned of the planned break-in at the Watergate and did nothing to stop it, that knew the full scope of Liddy's activities shortly after the Watergate arrests and kept those facts from proper authorities, that shredded Watergate evidence in the Chief of Staff's files, that tried to use one of its executive branch agencies as a cover for the Watergate operation, that was the scene of meetings at which high officials plotted to use the power and influence of the presidency to cover up crimes and obstruct justice, that saw advisors invoke the power of the presidency to use an FBI director in ways that would eventually cause him to resign, that used the president's fundraising powers to collect illegal corporate contributions, to raise funds to finance a crime, and to collect bribes for a criminal case, that discussed using the president's clemency prerogatives as early as June 1972 to keep the lid on Watergate and other crimes while misleading the American people by calling Watergate a third-rate burglary, that made offers of clemency for improper purposes, that announced in a presidential statement a Dean investigation clearing the White House when there had in fact been a cover-up, not an investigation, and the president had never, ever talked to Dean about Watergate, that discussed in the Oval Office unethical out-of-court contacts with the presiding judge in one of the Watergate civil suits, that purposely lied to the FBI and a federal grand jury, that encouraged campaign officials to commit perjury and plead the Fifth Amendment to obstruct justice, that used the president's personal attorney and White House staff to pay criminal hush money and to pay for a private eye operating out of the White House, that used its influence to get raw FBI files for improper purposes, that prevailed upon the FBI not to interview certain witnesses, that used patriotic concern for the presidency to pressure defendants to plead guilty in a criminal case, that used its influence to get special treatment for high officials before a federal grand jury, that plotted to cover up the Segretti story and denounced in the harshest terms those who uncovered the story, that noted it would assuredly be psychologically satisfying to cut the innards from Ellsberg and his clique, that obstructed congressional investigations of Watergate and related matters, that filed Watergate countersuits for the distorted purpose of using subpoena powers to delve into the financial and sexual activities of political opponents, that made numerous misleading or false statements about Watergate to the American people, that failed to promptly inform proper authorities about knowledge of crimes involving White House officials, that forced the resignation of a special prosecutor, attorney general, and deputy attorney general when their Watergate prosecution took an independent position, that suggested using the attorney general's powers to keep a Republican opponent off the primary ballot in Florida, that used the executive's authority over the media's regulatory agencies to intimidate the media, that ordered a personal tax audit, surveillance by an FBI agent and Secret Service agents, and an antitrust action, all in response to a newspaper article about one of the president's friends, that tried to punish foundations with views different than White House policy by pressuring the IRS to review their tax-exempt status, that set up a program to ensure that government contracts, grants, and loans would, as a matter of government policy, be political rewards, that treated the presidential pardon as a political tool, that used its power over the tax collection agency to gather intelligence on and harass political opponents, that issued instructions to hire a shaggy person with a McGovern button to sit in front of the White House and counter demonstrators at the funeral of J. Edgar Hoover, that infiltrated a Quaker vigil in front of the White House, that used the agency that is supposed to guard the president to spy on the president's political opponent, that ordered 24-hour surveillance of a political opponent, that used the departments to dredge up potentially embarrassing information on presidential contenders and then leaked it to the press, that used White House influence to obtain CIA equipment for the Ellsberg break-in, that used its entrustment with our national security to convince 4 Cubans to burglarize a political party, that ordered an FBI investigation of an unfriendly newsman to harass him, that proposed leaking confidential FBI files to embarrass the producer of a satirical movie, that used its control of important Watergate evidence and the privilege known as executive privilege to aid those supporting the president and to deprive or delay those in opposition, that made plans to eliminate professionals in government service who place their professional responsibilities above questionable White House political demands, that participated actively and formally in a campaign organization while drawing White House staff salaries, that ran secret letter-writing campaigns against Republican senators, and that generally emasculated the Republican Party. That, all of that, violated the concept of executive power in Article 2 of the Constitution. Extensive as the record is, it represents only selected examples. The important point is that it certainly is not what our founding fathers had in mind when they envisioned the presidency. 2. Enumerated powers and duties. The enumerated powers and duties of the President's office are set forth beginning with Section 2 of Article 2. That section grants the President direct power over cabinet officers. Much testimony before this committee demonstrated how those officers were used on behalf of the President's office. For example, an Attorney General, for a significant period of time, ran the President's re-election campaign while still in office at the Justice Department. His reason for this role was that it is very, very difficult to turn down a request by the President of the United States, even though the Attorney General himself later testified that he felt such a role in politics while still in office was wrong. As an illustration of the extent of that role, memos from CRP, such as one entitled Grantsmanship, suggesting an effective method of ensuring that political considerations be used in federal programs, were sent to the Attorney General from May 1, 1971 onward. At one point, it was even suggested that the Attorney General wield the power of his office to keep a Republican contender off the primary ballot in Florida. That campaign role also included an extraordinary meeting in the Attorney General's very office to review plans for bugging, mugging, burglary, prostitution, and kidnapping. Another Attorney General was placed in the awkward position of being asked immediately after the Watergate break-in to help get Mr. McCord out of jail before he was identified. He was soon thereafter warned of White House concern with a too aggressive FBI investigation. He was then asked to provide raw FBI Watergate files, improperly, to the White House. That same Attorney General was later used as a secret contact with this committee's investigation of Watergate, and was then removed from office in an apparent connection with the Watergate affair. He eventually became the first Attorney General in history convicted of a crime, for his testimony about presidential interference in an antitrust case involving a major contributor. A third Attorney General was forced to resign his office when he backed the special prosecutor's procedure for obtaining Watergate evidence from the White House. An Assistant Attorney General was also asked to provide raw FBI Watergate files, again improperly, to the White House, and was later told by the President not to investigate the Ellsberg break-in. A Deputy Attorney General was forced to resign when he backed the special prosecutor's decisions in the Watergate case. An Assistant Attorney General gave confidential Justice Department and FBI intelligence information to the President's re-election campaign at the direction of the White House. 3 Attorneys General, a Deputy Attorney General, and 2 Assistant Attorneys General, and all this was done on behalf of the Presidency, which has a constitutional responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. With respect to other cabinet officers, a Secretary of Commerce with all the authority as to corporate affairs that goes with that position was placed in charge of raising funds for the President's re-election, including, as it turns out, a number of illegal corporate contributions. A Secretary of Treasury met with a Milk Producers Association and supported their request for higher price supports. After the president granted higher support prices, the milk producers arranged for him to be offered at least $10,000 in cash for his personal use, a transaction for which he has been criminally indicted. He later aided them in tax and antitrust matters at a time when a large contribution to the president from the milk producers was being arranged. The Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service was criticized because practically every effort to proceed in sensitive areas is met with resistance, delay, and the threat of derogatory exposure. The director of the CIA, according to his own testimony and that of his assistant, was called to the White House and asked to use the CIA to cover up Watergate. The acting director of the FBI was brought to the White House and given material from the safe of one of the Watergate burglars to keep it hidden, an act which resulted in his eventual resignation. That same acting director turned over raw FBI files on Watergate to the White House, perhaps illegally, when assured it was at the president's request, which request the president has confirmed in public statements. He was rewarded by being left to twist slowly, slowly in the wind, while his nomination to permanent director was pending before the Senate, even though the president had reportedly already abandoned him. This is how the officers in the departments and agencies were used by the White House. And it is clear that those activities did not pertain to any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, as the Constitution requires in its grant of presidential authority in this area. Immediately following the section in Article 2, granting authority over departments and agencies, is a section giving the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. There is undisputed testimony that defendants in the Watergate criminal case were offered clemency in exchange for their silence. Aside from the issue as to who authorized the officers, they were particularly firm in the case of one defendant who was apparently ignoring the game plan. It must be recalled that only the president can grant clemency, and that by his own admission he discussed clemency as early as July 1972. When Watergate was being described as only a third-rate burglary. There is the well-documented case of a request from a former senator, and a close friend of the president, for a pardon on behalf of a prominent Jewish figure in Florida because of the political advantage that would follow. That pardon was granted. The beneficiary then gave the president's campaign $30,000. Article 2 also gives the executive the power to appoint ambassadors. Whereas this has often been a source of political reward, there is substantial evidence of an unusually well-organized and enforced program of ambassadorships for sale in return for specific support in the 1972 presidential campaign. Along with a point of power for ambassadors, the executive has a point of power over lesser officers of the United States. This power was used, for example, as a reward for at least one participant in Watergate, who received a prominent position in the Department of Commerce. Another CRP official in charge of certain spy activities pointedly reminded the White House of the work he had done when he applied for employment after the election. Plans were also drawn up to use this appointive power in the president's second term to get rid of officials across the board who rightfully placed their professional responsibilities in the way of White House political demands. These enumerated powers and duties of the executive are followed with the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Evidence was presented to this committee of a break-in by a White House unit, which break-in contributed to a mistrial in a major national security case, the Ellsberg case. Illegal use of wiretaps and agent provocateurs by the administration was the direct cause of mistrials or dismissals in most major conspiracy cases brought by the federal government during this same period. This was an executive branch that conspired to present perjury, lie to the FBI, and pay for the silence of key witnesses in the Watergate case. This was the executive that knew of a break-in related to the Ellsberg case and failed to take any action or report that fact. This was the executive that told an assistant attorney general not to investigate the Ellsberg matter. This was the administration that learned of the Watergate planning sessions, budget approval, that received illegal wiretap transcripts, and covered up or failed to promptly report White House involvement in Watergate as those facts became known. This is the White House that pressured the IRS, the Antitrust Division of Justice, the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the FCC to enforce laws not faithfully, but selectively. This is the same White House in which the president said in a conversation with John Dean on September 15, 1972, "We have not used the power in this first 4 years, as you know. We have never used it. We have not used the Bureau, FBI, and we have not used the Justice Department, but things are going to change now." The following months may or may not have been a change from what had been going on in 1970, 1971, and 1972, but they certainly were a sad chapter for our system of laws. End of section 31. Section 32 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Section 32, Chapter 11, Individual Views of the Senators of the Select Committee, Part 5. B. Separation of Powers. The separation of powers between three constitutionally equal and mutually independent branches of government is a fundamental constitutional doctrine. It is often referred to as the concept of checks and balances. Its success depends on self-adherence and restraint by those in a position to upset the balance. Tragically, the record of Watergate reflects a conscious attempt by the executive to undermine the responsibilities of the other two branches, as set forth in Article 1, which established the legislature, and Article 3, which established the judiciary. Activities with respect to the legislature began with the first congressional body to take an interest in the Watergate matter, the House Banking and Currency Committee. Every attempt was made to use executive power and influence, not to legitimately respond to that committee's investigation, but rather to obstruct, block, and actively mislead it. The executive branch had sole possession of critical evidence necessary to that investigation. Its overt attempts to undermine the committee's work were therefore significant. A different type of obstacle to the exercise of congressional powers occurred when nominees for high executive branch positions were sent before Senate committees for confirmation. In a number of instances, those nominees consciously misled committee inquiries and prepared testimony in such a way that relevant facts would be concealed. To the extent that the nomination process was subverted, those who participated or were responsible deprived the Congress of a fundamental constitutional duty, the duty to advise and consent. Discussions by senior White House officials of what were termed Watergate tactics and meetings at La Costa, California, focused on ways of obstructing an investigation of Watergate by the Senate. This included tactics such as the use of executive privilege to prevent the testimony of people from the White House, efforts to influence members of the Senate committee conducting the investigation, and the compiling of campaign financing data from those members' past campaigns in an effort to embarrass them. The Attack Group, a media-oriented White House group, arranged to meet with people from North Carolina thought to have embarrassing information about the chairman of this committee. Members of the administration were used as clandestine contacts with the Republicans on the committee to either give guidance or gather intelligence on what facts the committee possessed. John Dean was suggested as a liaison with the committee after he had admitted wrongdoing in the cover-up, and efforts towards having a White House Minority Council were put forward. Separation of powers also encompasses Article 3, the judiciary. Here again, the executive subverted the constitutional balance. As an example, on September 15, 1972, in a conversation in the Oval Office, the president was told by Mr. Dean that ex parte, out of court, contacts had been made with the judge in one of the Watergate-related civil suits. These contacts were for the purpose of obtaining an advantage in the case by keeping apprised of inside information, and they could well be unethical. There was no evidence that the White House took any steps to stop that activity. Still another abuse of the separation between the executive and the judicial branches was a contact made with the presiding judge in the Ellsberg case. That judge was asked if he would be interested in becoming director of the FBI. Significantly, the offer was made in rather clandestine circumstances at the very time the Ellsberg case was being tried, and at a time when it was becoming ever more possible that the break-in at Ellsberg psychiatrists might become known to the judge and jeopardize the case against Ellsberg. A contact under such circumstances by one of the top White House officials, and briefly by the president himself, once again threatened the concept of mutual independence intended by the separation of powers. C. The Bill of Rights. Unlike other amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights was drawn up as something of a cohesive Declaration of Rights. It comprises the first 10 amendments and represents a guarantee of individual freedoms that are fundamental to democracy. The First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments are the bulwark of the substantive guarantees in our Bill of Rights. They were, without exception, attacked and violated by Watergate and related events. That attack focused on the First Amendment, which by its very words, as well as the prominent role it has taken in our history, mark it as a profoundly important statement of individual rights. Specifically, it protects freedom of expression in 4 forms: freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. Those who spoke out against the administration, whether it was the chairman of the Democratic Party or senators expressing their opposition, whether it was a prominent or unknown citizen, or whether a member of the administration itself, often found themselves the target of official retaliation for having exercised their freedom of speech. People who were most vocal and could command some audience were considered enemies or opponents. One witness testified that the White House was continually seeking intelligence information about demonstration leaders and their supporters that would either discredit them personally or indicate that the demonstration was in fact sponsored by some foreign enemy. There were also White House requests for information regarding ties between major political figures, specifically members of the U.S. Senate, who opposed the president's war policies and the demonstration leaders. Interference with the freedom of speech of such opponents took a wide variety of forms. It included a program run by Donald Segretti, in which his operatives were asked to obtain hecklers to be used to disrupt the speeches of Democratic presidential candidates. According to Mr. Haldeman, the enemies list was drawn up to deprive those who were expressing vocal opposition to the White House of any platform for getting extraordinary publicity for their expression of opposition. Thus, they were labeled as enemies, their names circulated through the government, and as a group identified for semi-official executive branch action. Aside from the enemies or opposing candidates, selected individuals who expressed opposition were subjected to questionable tactics. As an example, Alfred Baldwin conducted surveillance of various outspoken senators and congressmen, including Representatives Abzug, Chisholm, Koch, and McCloskey, and Senators Javits, Kennedy, and Proxmire. Senator Kennedy was not only subjected to the Baldwin surveillance, he was also a target of Anthony Ulasewicz and John Caulfield, who investigated his political contributors, his accident at Chappaquiddick, and a trip to Hawaii on official business. Howard Hunt was asked by Mr. Colson to get information from a Kennedy friend in Rhode Island, and was provided with a CIA disguise for the operation. Mr. Haldeman, according to multiple testimony, asked that Senator Kennedy be subjected to 24-hour surveillance. Literally dozens of citizens who spoke out in opposition were targets of Ulasewicz investigations, which were paid for by the president's personal attorney, supervised by Mr. Ehrlichman, and conducted outside law enforcement channels, because legitimate law enforcement was not involved. The Watergate break-in itself, according to Jeb Magruder, was an attempt to find embarrassing information about Lawrence O'Brien, because Mr. O'Brien had been a very effective spokesman against our position on the ITT case. Magruder testified that, because of O'Brien's effectiveness in speaking out, we had hoped that information from the illegal break-in and wiretap might discredit him. This is an interesting use of the power and influence of the presidency in light of the First Amendment. It has what is often called, in Supreme Court First Amendment cases, a chilling effect. To the extent government actions intimidate free speech, they violate the Constitution. Those who chose to exercise constitutionally recognized symbolic speech, such as displaying a placard, were likewise interfered with. There was testimony that, during the late winter of 1971, when the President happened to look out the windows of the residence of the White House and saw a lone man with a large 10-foot sign stretched out in front of Lafayette Park, Mr. Higbee told Mr. Dean of the President's displeasure with the sign. Mr. Haldeman said the sign had to come down, and when Dean came out of Higbee's office, he ran into Mr. Dwight Chapin, who said that he was going to get some thugs to remove that man from Lafayette Park. He said it would take him a few hours to get them, but they could do the job. This was the White House, and its apparent version of First Amendment rights of free speech. It is also indicative of the White House attitude to the First Amendment's right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, an attitude that likewise runs through much of its attack on the press. The press, however, came in for especially intensive intimidation. A memo from Mr. Magruder to Mr. Haldeman, entitled "The Shotgun versus the Rifle," set out a plan for influencing news coverage of the White House. It gives some idea of the executive branch concept of our free press. Among its specific suggestions was a recommendation to utilize the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department to investigate various media relating to antitrust violations. Even the possible threat of antitrust action, I think, would be effective in changing their views. Such a recommendation is clearly wrong, an abuse of government, and an abuse of the First Amendment. In at least one case, involving an in-depth story on Charles G. Rebozo, an antitrust action was recommended against the Los Angeles Times, which owned the paper doing the story. Another recommendation in "The Shotgun versus the Rifle" was utilizing the Internal Revenue Service as a method to look into the various organizations that we are most concerned about. Just the threat of an IRS investigation will probably turn their approach. It would again be illegal. And again, in the Rebozo story, the newsman in charge of the story was, in fact, audited at the specific request of the White House. Newscaster Chet Huntley wrote a piece in Life magazine containing what were considered unfavorable remarks. The suggestions for retaliation against Huntley, in a White House memo by Mr. Higbee, contained a telling statement of broad philosophy. What we are trying to do here is tear down the institution. The broader tactics used against the press included meetings between Mr. Charles Colson and media representatives. In a summary of his meetings with the three network chief executives, he observed that they were terribly nervous about the Federal Communications Commission. He stated that, although they tried to disguise this, it was obvious. The harder I pressed them, CBS and NBC, the more accommodating, cordial, and almost apologetic they became. He concluded by observing that, "I think we can dampen their ardor for putting on loyal opposition-type programs." One of the basic guarantees of a free press is that government power not be used as prior restraint on the content of news. Individual newsmen that were apparently critical of the administration were likewise intimidated. One such newsman, Daniel Shore of CBS, was investigated by the FBI. When the investigation became known, the false story that he was being considered for a high administration position was put out, and Mr. Malek took the blame for the investigation, even though it had been ordered by Mr. Haldeman. Newspapers and reporters that uncovered the Watergate story were publicly attacked and ridiculed. In one case, 4 months after the break-in, the official White House position was that stories about Donald Segretti were stories based on hearsay, character assassination, innuendo, or guilt by association. That statement was later called inoperative after the White House had been unable to cover up the truth in the story. Newspapers were exploited by using them to put out stories known to be misleading, improper, and in some cases totally false. For example, Mr. Hunt testified that he used confidential FBI files to prepare a derogatory article on Mr. Leonard Boudin, an attorney in the Ellsberg case, which information Mr. Colson passed on to the working press. A memo from Mr. Haldeman stated that, We need to get our people to put out the story on the foreign or communist money that was used in support of demonstrations against the president in 1972. We should tie all 1972 demonstrations to McGovern, and thus to the Democrats as part of the peace movement. Even though there was no evidence to support such stories, the memo went on to recommend we could let columnists Evans and Novak put it out, and then be asked about it to make the point that we knew, and the president said it was not to be used under any circumstance. Falsely tying Senator McGovern to communist money was not the only false connection that was suggested. Mr. Patrick Buchanan recommended a number of campaign news strategies, including the Ellsberg connection, tying McGovern to him, Ellsberg, and his crime. Because if the country goes to the polls in November scared to death of McGovern, thinking him vaguely anti-America and radical and pro the left-wingers and militants, then they will vote against him, which means for us. This is a clear abuse of executive power as to the press. One of the most cold-blooded memos to come out of the White House during this period was written by Patrick J. Buchanan. It analyzed the pros and cons of a press attack on Dr. Ellsberg. The memo begins, "Having considered the matter until the early hours, my view is that there are some dividends to be derived from Project Ellsberg." Giving his personal view, Buchanan stated, "To me, it would assuredly be psychologically satisfying to cut the innards from Ellsberg," an attitude which has brought his fellow White House staffer, Mr. Colson, a jail term. Nevertheless, Buchanan concluded that the Ellsberg issue would not be turned around in the public mind by a few well-placed leaks. Lest there be any doubt about his position, he then stated, "This is not to argue that the effort is not worthwhile, but that simply we ought not now to start investing major personnel resources in the kind of covert operation not likely to yield any major political dividends to the President." No legal or moral problems for Buchanan, just an objection to the management end of it. Mr. Buchanan also testified as to documents surreptitiously taken from the Muskie campaign and photographed by Fat Jack. Buchanan testified that he did get the material on 2 occasions, and he did recommend that it be sent to columnists Evans and Novak. Evans and Novak did print, on 2 occasions I believe, material from Muskie's campaign. Here again was a high official using the credibility of the White House to peddle wrongfully obtained confidential information. Material obtained secretly from the Commerce Department relative to Senator Muskie's apparently legitimate attempts to help the Maine sugar beet industry as their senator was leaked to the press for political purposes when that industry began to fail. Information from the Department of Defense as to Senator McGovern's personal and confidential war records was recommended for leak to the press. Testimony was received that Mr. Colson ordered the fabrication of State Department cables relative to the Kennedy administration's handling of President Diem's assassination, and recommended that this false information be leaked to Mr. William Lambert of Life magazine. All this was a blatant attempt to improperly use government power and responsibilities to distort the constitutional role of the press. Finally, the official press spokesman for the White House consistently told the press and the American people versions of Watergate that were not true, when he and those who prepared him were in a position to know, or in fact knew, that his statements were untrue. The President himself misled the press in news conferences and official statements as to the investigation, its results, and the substance of evidence involving himself and the Watergate matter. The Fourth Amendment fared no better. It guarantees the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. It was expressly violated by burglaries and warrantless wiretaps. As an example, this constitutional safeguard was at the center of illegalities contained in the so-called 1970 Intelligence Plan. In a colloquy during the course of this committee's hearings, the chairman and Mr. Dean discussed the elements of that intelligence plan. It was described as recommending 1. Techniques for removing limitations on electronic surveillance and penetration, 2. The use of mail coverage, 3. A technique designated as surreptitious entry, 4. Development of campus sources of information, and 5. The use of military undercover agents. The chairman rightly noted, and the witness concurred, that resort to burglary, electronic surveillance, and penetration without a court order is a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment. Nevertheless, on July 5, 1970, a memo written by Mr. Haldeman indicated that the President of the United States gave his approval to the plan. There is additional evidence that events took place which closely parallel the recommendations in the 1970 plan. In contrast with the evidence that the plan was approved, there is no documentary evidence that the plan was at any time officially withdrawn, although one witness claimed it was. The instance of burglaries and wiretapping have been well documented. They include the break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, the possible break-in at publisher Hank Greenspun's office, the 4 attempts and 2 successful break-ins at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, the plans to break in at McGovern's campaign headquarters, proposed penetrations of the Potomac Associates and the Brookings Institution, questionable wiretaps of newsmen and government officials, wiretaps of Spencer Oliver, Lawrence O'Brien, and columnist Joseph Kraft. This disregard for the Fourth Amendment proceeded in spite of apparently severe warnings and objections by one of the most experienced figures in law enforcement in this nation's history, J. Edgar Hoover. The Fifth Amendment was likewise violated. However, it is more appropriately discussed along with the 14th Amendment in the next section examining due process of law. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial, the right to the evidence of witnesses, and the right to subpoena evidence from witnesses, an important principle in our system of justice. While it may be temporarily obscured by the plight of high officials in Watergate, history will record that 7 men were brought to trial in 1973 for the Watergate break-in. 6 of those men spent considerable time in jail. To date, no persons have paid a higher price for Watergate through the justice system. When history judges our system of laws, the fairness of the trial those men went through will be at the fore. Viewed in that light, the so-called cover-up takes on a somewhat different significance. It was nothing less than a massive interference with the constitutional right of several American citizens to a fair trial. They were categorically denied the testimony of witnesses who possessed evidence that was critical to their defense. Perjury was planned and orchestrated from within the White House itself. Evidence was destroyed. Key witnesses were excused from giving testimony before the grand jury, avoiding their constitutional duty. A speedy trial was opposed, not because it would result in greater justice, but because it served the political ends of the White House. Even the defendants themselves were paid to not give testimony, thereby denying any hope to at least one of them who might have preferred a fair trial. Offers of clemency, family support, and rehabilitation were used for the same purpose. In an opposite sense, the Sixth Amendment's guarantees of a witness's testimony were again subverted when counter-lawsuits were undertaken against Democratic officials, partly to use the power of taking witnesses' depositions to get at embarrassing information. Here, the tactic was to put political opponents under oath and use that circumstance and power to elicit confidential information. Those who denied witnesses to their own could not apparently resist enforcing and invoking the Sixth Amendment's guarantees when it came to their opponents. D. Due process of law. The concept of due process, put simply, means the right to fair and just treatment under the law. It is rooted in Chapter 39 of the Magna Carta, in which King John declared that no free man shall be taken or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Recent Supreme Court cases have described due process, which is guaranteed by the Fifth and 14th Amendments, as embodying a system of rights based on moral principles so deeply embedded in the traditions and feelings of our people as to be deemed fundamental to a civilized society as conceived by our whole history. Due process has been even more succinctly described by the Supreme Court as that which comports with the deepest notions of what is fair and right and just. It is the backbone of justice in America, and it was dramatically missing in the evidence of not only the Watergate criminal proceedings, but in the Ellsberg case and countless other cases with political overtones in the period directly leading to Watergate. The particular phraseology associated with due process has been generally used in close association with precise safeguards of accused persons. Nevertheless, it is equally a restraint on action by the government that unfairly discriminates against our citizens or the exercise of their rights. Those two guarantees have often been called procedural and substantive due process. Both were violated by the events leading to and including Watergate. The obvious example of procedural abuses were the trials. In the Ellsberg case, information for use against the defendant was sought by means of a warrantless break-in, an act that eventually contributed to that case being dismissed. In addition, the presiding judge in that case was offered an attractive job as FBI director in the midst of the trial. The offer came from Mr. Ehrlichman, who was responsible for supervision of the so-called plumbers, at a time when Ehrlichman knew about the break-in by the plumbers and presumably knew of its potential consequences. Dr. Ellsberg's right to a fair trial was also jeopardized by tactics that attempted to destroy his public image, discredit his associates, and attack publishers who printed the Pentagon Papers. One of the president's closest advisors has been sentenced to 1 to 3 years in jail for that tactic. The direct interference with a fair trial for the Watergate defendants has already been documented. In addition, those defendants were subjected to prejudicial public statements that they were third-rate burglars, blackmailers, and even double agents. The important point is that the accusations came from the White House, and that the White House was in a position to remove those labels by following its legal duty of providing all relevant evidence. Perhaps of even greater significance is the vast number of cases involving those accused of conspiracies against the United States. The improper use of wiretaps, agent provocateurs, and informers resulted in the dismissal of most of those cases. While this was not directly a focus of the Watergate investigation, it became relevant in examining the climate and attitudes that led to the Watergate plan. Criminal cases were not the only instances of due process violations. The fair and right and just application of our laws suffered when antitrust actions were generated on the basis of political considerations, when income tax audits were ordered because a newsman wrote an article the White House did not like, when an enemies list was compiled so that the laws could be applied more strictly or to the disadvantage of opponents, when White House staff members had access to FBI files pertaining to their own investigation, when they were given special treatment before a grand jury, when the intelligence gathered by the various agencies of our government was collected, evaluated, and distributed in apparent violation of the agency's statutes, when the military was used to spy on American citizens working for the Democratic Party. All of this violated the Fifth Amendment and, in some cases, the 14th Amendment. In the process, Watergate and its predecessor activities violated one of the broadest principles of our system of laws, a concept so fundamental that it is the basis of fully 1/4 of all litigation that comes before the Supreme Court of the land. This is apparently what happens when the witness, who was the Attorney General during most of that period, can be asked whether he exalted the political fortunes of the President before the President's responsibility to perform his constitutional duties to see that the laws are faithfully executed, and he responds, "I think that is a reasonable interpretation." End of section 32.